Hey, welcome to Partnership Work, where we explore what it takes to reach across the walls that divide us and get people working together to improve our world. I'm Paul Kuttner. On today's episode, we're taking a dive into the world of community coalitions. When it comes to tackling the big issues, individual community organizations can only do so much. So, like the X-Men or the Avengers, they team up, combine their powers. These days, coalitions are a common feature of the social change landscape, but they are a lot more complicated than they look on paper. They can be fragile things, quick to fall apart over distrust, competition, and power struggles. My guest today knows all about building and maintaining coalitions. Chioma Nnaji has spent over 2 decades organizing and supporting community coalitions in public health. In our conversation, Chioma talks about how her childhood helped mold her into a consummate community builder, and how she found herself, quite unexpectedly, working in HIV and AIDS. We discuss her approach to organizing across African diaspora communities rooted in a shared African identity. Chioma shares some of the lessons she's learned about how to bring coalition members to the table, how to develop shared language, how to help people step into their power, and how to maintain a coalition over the years or even decades it takes to see real change. Chioma lives in the Boston area, so she was able to join me here in the studio at Urban Media Arts. We had a lot of fun and more than a few laughs, so I hope you enjoy it as well. Let's get to it. Today, I am joined in the studio by Chioma Nnaji. Chioma is an organizer and community health worker who, for over 2 decades, has been working with African diaspora communities on issues around public health, racial justice, and immigrant rights. She is Senior Program Director for the Multicultural AIDS Coalition in Boston, where she founded and directs the Africans for Improved Access program. Recently, Chioma helped launch the African Immigrant Health Research Consortium. I had the honor of attending their first summit this past year, Africanizing the Research Paradigm, which was honestly one of the most energizing events I've been to in quite a while. Chioma has a background in theater. She sits on a bunch of boards and a whole lot of other things that I don't have time to list. I will link to her full bio in the show notes. So Chioma, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Paul. I always enjoy intros because I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's me. Oh, really? Did I really do that? Okay. So I always enjoy how people introduce me. So thank you.
No, thank you. So I'm starting out all the episodes with the same question. And since you've been involved in so many things, I'm super curious how you're going to answer it.
Okay.
So when you are at a family event or a party and someone asks you, hey, what do you do? What do you say?
Oh, that's a big, I don't know. I mean, oh, wow. So I started off and I still do HIV AIDS work, right? So I feel like it was easy for me to answer that question because I used to say, oh, depending on who I'm talking to, I'll say sexual health, HIV, and now I find myself saying like public health because I'm across so many different things. But, I don't know. I mean, and then if people like want to dig deeper, I might go into particular aspects of my work. I think what I find interesting is that when I say public health, it's more understood at this point because of COVID-19, right? Like COVID-19 brought a lot of awareness to the general population about what is public health, right? And so I think now I feel comfortable saying public health. But probably maybe 15 years ago, definitely the first thing out of my mouth wouldn't have been public health. It would have been sexual health, HIV. I work with communities.
Right. Maybe tell me a bit about how you ended up in public health in the HIV field.
Oh, I fell into it. Like, never expected to be in public health, right? Never expected to be here working in the United States. I finished my bachelor's degree at Florida A&M University, and that was in healthcare management, right? And my father chose my degree, okay? My father chose my degree. So I was like, oh, Daddy, I want to do healthcare. And he was like, you definitely are not the doctor. You're definitely not the nurse. Then he was like, okay, I have somebody who runs a program around healthcare management. Let's put you in there.
Okay.
Right. So I did healthcare management. I worked for the government of Florida, really focusing on Medicaid, Medicare for 2 years. And it was like hard 2 years, right? Because I was sitting there making decisions about people's lives, looking at budgets and looking at numbers, right? Not really understanding why people are in their certain position, or why people couldn't cover their bills or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't feel good about it. So I was like this healthcare management thing is not for me. So then, long story short, I had a partner at that time who graduated and was going to New York.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was like, yeah, you need to figure out, because you're not staying here with your daddy in Florida. You need to figure out what you're going to do. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll be going up north. And so I had a cousin who was doing a master's in public health, right, in an MD.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I ended up in the area of public health and came to BU and did my MPH. And then while I was finishing up my thesis for my public health, I just wanted to do volunteer work, because in my mind, I was about to move to West Africa somewhere and do work with NGOs. And I found a volunteer opportunity at the Multicultural AIDS Coalition, working with the population, the communities that I wanted to work with, really doing the organizing work that I wanted to do. And so I've been there for 24 years.
Yeah.
That's a long time
Yeah,
to be in one organization.
That's true.
I can say I'm one of the longest. Myself and the executive director have been there the longest. Yeah. So special.
One thing I know, when I look at what you've done through the Multicultural AIDS Coalition elsewhere, is a lot of your work being with coalitions and large collectives. Why are coalitions important for the kind of work you do?
Yeah.
And maybe what were some of your first experiences with coalitions?
Yeah. I actually started off in the public health field as coordinating a coalition, right? And so it was a coalition focused on HIV/AIDS and African immigrants. And one thing that I realized when you're working with coalition, these are community coalitions, right? We can have all different types of coalitions led by different individuals and organizations. But particularly, I've been a part of community coalitions. And so one thing that I've realized that's critically important when you're working with community coalitions is knowing when to step back. Right? Knowing when to be the fly on the wall and let what needs to happen in the room happen, right? Or what needs to happen in community happen. And sometimes that's hard, especially if you're you're with an organization, and organizations come with certain maybe parameters because of funding, or maybe because they're the backbone organization, they have a certain agenda. But if you're serious about doing equity work, if you're serious about doing community health work, it's important that when you're running coalitions, to be able to step back and say the community knows what the community needs. And not only do they know what they need, they have the solutions to address whatever challenges they're dealing with, right? And most times, 9 out of 10, the issue isn't having the solution. The issue is having the resources and the access to power and privilege to be able to implement what needs to happen.
Yeah. So say a bit more what you mean, like how you define a community coalition.
So for me, a community coalition is when the majority of the people around the table identify with the issue and represent the individuals who are being mostly impacted, right? And so you could have coalitions, like the coalition that I actually started with was a coalition of African immigrants living with HIV, African leaders and community-based organizations. The Massachusetts Department of Public Health was represented on the coalition. We had healthcare providers on the coalition, researchers on the coalition. The core of the members were individuals who were most impacted, either impacted in terms of they're living with HIV, or impacted in terms of they had family members and friends who were living with HIV, right? Most of them were African immigrants. And so when you have a coalition like that, then you're very clear and you're very centered around community needs, right? Sometimes when you have a coalition that is talking about community needs and you have one or two community people who represent the who are represented on the coalition, the focus gets lost.
Yeah.
The agenda becomes somebody else's agenda, and oftentimes the voices of communities get dissipated, right? Because there's only two of them at the table, right? Out of a coalition, maybe of a membership of 20, right? And so it's critically important when you're talking about community coalitions that that coalition reflects the community that you're actually wanting to have a positive impact on.
What were some of the first, coming into that as a young public health professional, what were some of the first things that you had to learn about how to do coalition work?
I had to unlearn all the stuff I learned in my master's program. That was the first thing. That was the first thing.
Okay.
Like all the stuff, all the theories, all the ways in which programs should be developed, I had to unlearn that, right? And not saying that it's not important, but walking into community, you have to really let go of whatever you think you know, right? And so I had to learn all that, and I unlearned that quickly because I was around folks who did not mind telling me, right? And even sort of my mentor in the work, Rosette Saranga, she was very clear. She was very grounded in what does it mean to do community organizing work, right? And she was very clear about creating space for community to define the solutions in the challenges and understanding challenges. And so that was the first thing: unlearn what you learned in your master's degree, right? And then, like I said, the second thing is knowing when to step back. But then also what was important in the work and what I continue to sort of learn and grow in is how are you transparent, right? So you mentioned the African Immigrant Health Collaborative that started. We started about 5 years ago, right? And one of the things I had to learn as being one of the founding members, but also my organization being the backbone of that collaborative, is being transparent with partners around the table, right? Folks are okay if you say, hey, look, because we're the backbone organization, we need 15% of all budget to come to us to support the administrative work. Folks are okay with that when you tell them the reason why, right? The problem comes when you're like, oh, yeah, so the budget, so can we talk about that at the next meeting? Oh, no, so I didn't bring the paperwork for the budget. No, did I say this meeting? I meant next meeting. You know what I'm saying? Right?
Yeah.
And so transparency is important, right? Transparency also for me was about understanding my positionality in the work. And I had to learn that early on when I was doing, when I started in 2000 when I started, right? Like I had to understand my own positionality. Yes, I have a lot of similarities as it relates to African immigrant communities. And I also have a lot of differences. Similarities, my father's Nigerian. I was brought up in Nigerian culture as well as African-American U.S. Black folks born here in the U.S., that rich history and culture. And I also had to realize that especially now, today, the political environment, the social environment, that what does it mean for me to walk around, talk about immigrant rights as someone who holds a U.S. passport? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so even doing the work, recognizing sort of my position in that and recognizing that I have a certain level of privilege and power because English is my first language, because I have a U.S. passport. I can say I was born here in the U.S., because I don't have an accent, right? Because I can run my mouth off and nobody's going to tell me to go back to my country, right? I have a certain level of privilege that I can use for good, but I also need to know what that privilege can create in terms of tension with the communities that I work with, right? And so I have to constantly be intentional about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you were first learning how to do this work, do you remember any big mistakes that you made that you learned quickly? Were there any big mistakes that you remember learning from in those early days?
Oh, big mistakes. I got one. I was doing similar to what's going on now, right? Like there's a lot of know your rights trainings that are happening, right? So at this point I was already doing a lot of coalition work. And so I thought I had sort of the people there that would come, right? Like that would be a part of it. So it was the know your rights training. that I was partnering with a local organization. I'm not going to mention the name, a local organization. And so we had the date, we had the time. It was happening on a Saturday, not during the week because people were working. Like I thought I had it all figured out, right? We had food coming. It was going to be rice and chicken. It was going to be cheese and crackers. Put that on the flyer. Like I was like, I'm in it. Like I know what I'm doing because I've been doing this coalition work for a minute. Come 10 o'clock, nobody was there. Come 10:05, nobody was there. Come 10:30, I was like, no problem. Africans are typically late. They'll come. Come 11 o'clock, nobody showed up. Right. And so I had to really sit down and say, okay, why isn't anybody here? Like I told the coalition, I emailed them. Right. I emailed them. Right. And so that was my aha moment. Or maybe that sort of helped me figure out what does it mean in terms of building relationships in this work and the power of relationships, right? And I sort of knew that because I'm running a coalition. I had everybody's phone numbers, right? Up to 50 people in this coalition. I knew everybody's phone numbers, was able to call people, but emailing is not enough, right? Dropping off flyers is not enough. What I learned and what I had to understand is making phone calls, having that personal connection, building off of the relationships that you have so that people will know, oh, okay, this is something that I can do. The other thing that I realized is that concepts are not always transferable across cultures, right? Like this idea of know your rights, right, was not sort of fully a full understood concept. I don't mean in terms of education and stupidity. I mean in terms of like cultural concepts around know your rights, right? Like you won't see a know your rights training on the continent, right? And so really understanding how do you take what maybe is a concept happening here in the US and really unpack it so that communities that need the information will know what's going to happen at those events or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's a core of my understanding in doing this work is the power of relationships. Yeah. Like you have to focus on that relationship, right? And that means you might be going to a couple of baby showers. You might be going to a couple of weddings, right? That means maybe you'll be going to an after party, right? Like people need to see that you're committed to them and their community. And it's not just about, in our case, getting people tested for HIV, right? Folks need to see it's more than that for you.
You clearly are a connector and community builder. Where do you think that comes from? Like, is that something that started off early in your life? Is that something you learned as a child? Like, where does the skills and the aptitude or just your tendency to want to bring people together, where do you feel like that started?
That's a good question. I mean, I know that in my childhood and growing up, like my mother and father were very much community oriented, right? Like to the point that I hated it because they knew all my teachers. Like my mom was best friends with my principal at my high school, like to the point that I was like, okay, this is done. My father knew everybody across campus, so the dean of my program knew my father very well. Okay. So it was like, ugh, right. And so I always grew up knowing the importance of community and grounding yourself in community and doing community work. And doing community work in a way in which you're giving what you can give, right? And you're not looking for anything in return. So I was always, and of course, growing up, you don't understand that until you get older and you sort of see, because you're like, we have to go to another event? Like, really, Mom? Or why are we always in Girl Scouts, right? But being able to understand the meaning of that later on in my life, I think was critical to me. Figuring out what I wanted. I had to figure it out. Like I told you, I was working at government doing healthcare, managing programs, Medicare and Medicaid programs. So it's not something that was intuitive, but I figured out where was my happy place along my journey, and where I could really lend my skills and my knowledge and my willingness to grow and learn, where that would, the best place for that. And I really enjoy, like you said, I love partnership work. I think in this time that we're in right now, partnerships are going to be the answer. They really are going to be the answer. Multi-sector partnerships, centered on community, I would even say led by community. That's what's going to be the answer to get us out of where we are right now, to sustain us as a greater community, a global community. That's where we're going to have to lean into.
Amen. So you talk about multi-sector partnership.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of some of the work you've done there? And I'm particularly interested in sort of talking through, how did you bring those people to the table to the point where they're really able to both collaborate and center community?
Yeah. So I can use an example of, it's not really in the HIV space. It's more in my work in doing collective impact work. And that's particularly with sort of my business, Ultra Transformations, where I actually facilitate partnership development, ways in which you level partnerships to have greater impact, right? And so one of the partnerships that I've been working with, is a partnership that was focused on economic mobility, right? For a particular sector of the community that was being most impacted, right? Black mothers, right, who might be the only breadwinners in their family, right, the only ones making money in their family, the head of household, right, head of households. And so what we ended up doing is I was brought in to create the partnership, the partnership being able to focus on a common agenda and figuring out solutions to the problem, and then collectively deciding like what's the next step around that, right? And what was interesting is that this partnership was actually being led by a foundation. And so they brought in business owners, Black mothers, employers and trainers, universities in that area, folks who focus on career development, right? So the one thing I realized quickly was that everybody had a different understanding of economic mobility, right? Like that was something I realized quickly in having conversations with different partners. And so I always find that starting a partnership with shared language is critically important, right? It doesn't matter, and it doesn't even matter how long y'all been together, right? Like even in the African partnership that I'm a part of, like we're always sort of being clear on our language, right? And what we mean. And so with that partnership, it's clearly important that we start with shared language. So we literally had conversations around, so what is economic mobility to you? What is economic mobility to you? So of course, right, you got the business people in the university, the educational programs talking about, oh, we have to do more training. Oh, we have to, make sure that mothers have the skills and knowledge that they need, right? And the mothers are saying, no, I just need you to have childcare so that I can actually come to the job in a time that makes sense, right? Or I need you to have flexible time because my child has special needs. My child goes to school this time to this time, and I need to be able to pick up my child at school, right? Like, I don't need you to tell me to be, as part of my onboarding to be in a training for 3 months, right? Like, that's not really what I need, right? And so being able to have a conversation around understanding what would get people to this particular population to a point of economic mobility, and having that shared language, I think it was a pivotal point, right? And so any partnership, I think you have to start the foundation with, what exactly are we talking about? And let's all get on the page about that. Then we can get on the same page about the agenda for the partnership. Yeah.
And how do you prepare people to listen to that, to take one another into account in that way? That's a rare kind of space that you're talking about.
I always like having fun. That's why I talk about facilitation as, a power move, right? I enjoy people being comfortable enough to share with each other and laugh and have fun with each other, right? And so that can look at different kinds of ways, right? For me, it depends. It could be when I'm working with a group, like what does the space look like that we're working in, right? Or it could be, how am I even gonna have people introduce themselves to each other, right? Or it could be, how do I walk into the room, right? One partnership I was working with, my mom actually got an opportunity to come to. Yeah, it was anyway. My mom was like, she needs something to do. I was like, come, and flew her down and was like, okay, come with me to this partnership meeting. Then we'll take the weekend off and go somewhere, right? So she was in the room, right? And so I was just like, well, my mommy is my mommy, and everybody should know my mommy because she's fabulous, right? So I was like, oh, hey, everybody, I have a guest. I'm so excited to introduce you all. This is my mommy, right? And that set a different tone, right? So then everybody's like, oh, that's your mom. Oh, dun, 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 dun. And so it allowed people to see me in a certain way, right? And then it allowed them to even open up, maybe about their relationship, about their mom, or how they were so excited to see me having my mom. So how do you humanize a space so that people can connect in ways in which might be unexpected, but definitely strips them down from that sort of, I'm here as a professional and I need to represent my organization, right? Yeah.
I love that. So that sort of gets to the beginning of a partnership. One thing I'm interested in, kind of what partnerships look like and how they change over time. So I'm curious if you can talk to me about National African Immigrant HIV and Hepatitis Awareness Day, because that was one I know you worked on for a really long time. It was successful.
Oh, wow.
But it took years. And so I'm wondering, tell me if you could tell us a little bit about that effort and maybe one or two things you learned from that long-term effort to start that day.
Yeah, so that started in 2014. And so just to give context, right? In the HIV space, we have HIV awareness days. And so those are big things because it brings visibility to whatever issue you're trying to bring visibility to, and also could potentially lead to funding and new opportunities, right? And so in 2014, a group of organizers, African organizers doing work within the HIV space, came together and said we should have an HIV awareness day for African immigrants. We also said that because hepatitis B is increasing in our community, we just slap on hepatitis B as part of the awareness day. So again, it came out of community organizing. It came out of activists. It came out of community knowing what was needed in order to bring more visibility to this day. Now, the question was, how are we going to get it in the front of Congress and in front of House of Representatives? Like, how are we going to get a champion for this, right? Because it has to be stamped and signed off. And so it took until 2024 is when we actually got it recognized as a federal HIV awareness day. And so the twist and turns around that is that the same people we started with are not the same people we ended with, right?
Okay.
And one thing I've learned in doing organizing work is that's okay, right? Because people are going to join the movement or join the journey when they can, right? And so you have to create space where there's staying power, and it might fluctuate along the way, right? And so, of course, staying power meant that we will constantly took the responsibility to be a lead. Somebody has to do that in partnerships that are going to be sustainable, right? That doesn't mean the lead can't transfer from organization to individual to individual, but somebody has to always take the lead, right? And so what I was able to take from that is that creating a process where people can get in where they can fit in at the moment of their lives or the point of where their organization is critically important. I think often we have these expectations and we want people, no, you're going to be here for 2 years. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. And that sometimes is the fault. It is what causes partnerships to fail, right? Because you're creating all these parameters and boundaries, right? But if you are in a position of creating a flexible process, a flexible relationship with your partners where it's like, oh, okay, I see that like you're struggling this month, right? All right, like take some time off for 6 months. Whenever you're ready, come back, right? Where you have sort of a partnership that operates in that way, you will have staying power. And it might not look consistent to you, right? Because you don't have the same people at the same table, but you have people moving it forward. And if at any point you can pull on this person, this person, this person, and they'll be saying the same thing because you've created a space where they can come in, they can be grounded in the work, and if they need to step back, they can, and they can come right back in at the same place, right? And continue the work, right? And so that's what I had to learn in creating, because it was exhausting. It was exhausting to be constantly talking about, we need this awareness day, right? Then it's like, okay, but we need this. This partner will come and say, okay, yeah, I can have this. They might only be here for the next 2 years, right? But they've done their part and they've committed. And then if I call them the third year and be like, I just need you to, send this out to your network, they'd be like, oh yeah, cool. Because I'm not holding them accountable to where I think they should be, right? And I understand that they have the capacity to do what they can at that moment. And then if I need them for something, they'll be right there because they're still committed to the work.
Love it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. So I do want to talk about one of your recent projects, the African Immigrant Health Research Consortium. So I got to go to your first event, which was fabulous, by the way. And it felt very different from certainly any other research meeting that I've been to in a long time.
Everybody keeps saying that. I'm like, where y'all go? Like, what y'all do?
I don't know. Just the amount of hugging and laughing and taking photos and just the connections that were happening at the tables. It was just really inspiring. And so I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about how that group came together and where that idea came from.
So if I'm being very transparent, right, it came through a grant. We were able to receive funding from PCORI, Patient Centered Outreach Research Institute, to do work around creating a research partnership. We knew we wanted it to be community-led, right? And so as part of that project, we said that we would do a national meeting, right? So I really didn't want to I didn't want it to be as big as it was. The partnership push for that. This is again, right, where you have to step back because it ain't about me, right? It's about what the partnership says. I was fine with having a small meeting and let's keep it going. But the partnership.
Who were your partners?
So we have 6 partners that make up the African Immigrant AIHRC is what we call it, AIHRC. And so these are 6 partners. Majority of them are grassroots or community-based organizations. Providing services to African immigrants, and then some of them overall just refugee and immigrants. So it's everything from resettlement services to social services to healthcare services. And so in putting together that event, we knew it needed to reflect what we were talking about, right? Like, how can we be talking about challenging colonial understandings of what research is and how it should look like? And we show up in the very, very traditional way in which research is presented and talked about. Like, how can we do that? We show up in not acknowledging who the communities that we're talking about, African immigrants. And so it started with the space, right? I talked about that, like creating a space first, right? And so we decided that we were going to do everything African, from African fabric to kola nut, the importance of understanding. We knew that if we have Africans walking in that room and they see kola nut on the table, that they were going to feel welcomed. Because kola nut is, you will find it across the continent of Africa as a way to start ceremonies, start rituals, to welcome people into a home, or that you give as a gift to somebody, right? So we knew the significance of the kola nut, right? We knew the significance of having African fabric, right? The shows like the various cultures represented there, right? So we were very intentional on certain things because we wanted to not Africanizing the research paradigm also meant Africanizing the space in which we're going to hold the conversations. Yeah.
One of the things I'm really curious about, you organize in African immigrant communities. We're talking about people who have backgrounds in potentially over 50 different countries, each with its own histories and cultural backgrounds and languages. What does it look like for you to build community and partnership and solidarity in that context? Where do you start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, just in Nigeria, we're talking about 250 different ethnic groups, right? That's just Nigeria, right? So Africa has, 56, 54, depending on how you're counting with the smaller islands, countries, right? And every country has however many ethnic groups. And so ways in which to think about how we're building community in that space is what are some of the similarities across the continent that we can all pull from, right? In my work in HIV and AIDS, in my work in organizing around research as a tool for advocacy, one of the threads across African communities, no matter where they're from, is the concept of we, right? This idea that we are a collective, right? We're not individuals, right? What I do impacts you and what you do impacts me, right? My issues are your issues are mine, right? And so of course sometimes that could be a hindrance, right? But I use that as a way of how are we talking about our issues in the way in which we are building and we're addressing our issues as a collective, right? And that was very important in HIV/AIDS work because of the level of stigma that was happening, right? So I couldn't be like, well, that person's living with HIV, how are we helping that person, right? It had to be like, we have a challenge in our community. How are we coming together as a community to address it, right? And then there's just like visual cues that you just know that, that's African, right? Whether it's the material, whether it's cultural practice, like I talked about cola nut, like even at the event, you saw that we did a libation, right? Very African. You can go anywhere and you see people do a libation, traditional libations, right? And so how do we pull on those cultural cues to, support communities and not only engaging, but also saying like, this is something that I can own, right?
Love it. So one of the things that you and I connected over when we first met was theater. You have a background in theater of the oppressed. You've done some theater work connected to some of your HIV work. How do you think about the role of theater and the arts in building coalitions and partnerships?
It's not so far-fetched from what happens on the continent of Africa. I think here in the US, it's a foreign concept, right? Like, if I was doing HIV/AIDS on the continent, I would be doing it through theater and the arts. If you look at some of the ways in which interventions and development has happened on the continent. I think that for me, the reason why I engage in particular theater of the oppressed, but other sort of participatory theater methods is because it allows people to get out of their head and really to think about this issue or this challenge in different ways, right? The beauty about theater of the oppressed is like and since you're a theater head like I am, like that it doesn't just unpack the issue, right? It personalizes the issue and then it forces you to think about how you can intervene, right? And so that's what I love about sort of ways in which we can introduce or bring in theater. But then arts has always been part of the HIV/AIDS movement. It's because of the arts, right? The arts was like the biggest advocacy, movement happening in HIV and AIDS to show the fact that people are dying and we need to do something about it. We have the AIDS quilt, which was done.
Act Up.
Act Up was really sort of integrated into the arts scene. So arts has always been there as a tool for advocacy, as a tool for visibility, as a tool for people to share what's going on in their personal lives without having to voice it, right? And so I think theater is just a way for people to embody what's happening in their lives and to embody what's happening in the community and really sort of allow their other senses to guide them on what the solution could look like, right? Because we get caught up in our head, we get so caught up in our head, and that usually is the main barrier to actually collaborating, partnering, and on whatever issues that we want to deal with.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. What is the hardest or most frustrating part of doing this work?
Is people not understanding their own power. That's the hardest part. The hardest part is people not understanding their own power. because the way that we've been socialized, particular communities who are racialized and marginalized on a day-to-day basis, about what they can and cannot do, about what space they're allowed to be in and what space they don't belong in, about what their limitations are, right? And so you internalize that. And so it's a harder process to support people in seeing their own power, right? I don't use the word empowerment because I think that further notes that someone is marginalized. For me, what the issue is that systemically we've been told something and we've internalized that. And so it makes it challenging for us to, it makes it challenging for people to step in their power. And so that's for me the hardest part because I know for sure, without a question of the doubt, that the answer is going to come from community.
Yeah.
I know for sure. I don't. And if we're not grounded in that, then we're going to continue to go in this circle of what ifs, right?
So what do you do to help people or support people to step into their power?
Yeah. Part of that is unpacking the reasons why, right? Mm-hmm. Unpacking the reasons why folks may feel like they're in a certain situation or are in a certain situation. So creating space to have that dialogue and that conversation. I think also, even before that, I would say just acknowledging how like shit is real and shit is hard, right? Like not dismissing people's struggle, right? Like just because I can't speak to what does it mean to migrate from the continent of Africa through the Mexican border doesn't mean that it's not hard, right? Like it wasn't my experience, but I hear people saying that shit was hard. That shit was hard, period, right? Acknowledgement. And so being able to create, am I allowed to cuss? I guess it's too late. I should have asked for the parameters of the discussion.
They're going to put that little explicit sign next to next to the podcast.
Like, gosh, she cussed a lot. No, I didn't cuss that much today. But yeah, so that acknowledgement and then creating space for people to unpack that. And then I'm a strong believer. I mean, of course, since, I sit in partnerships and I support partnerships, the power of collaboration, right? So someone might be challenged with something, someone else might be challenged with the same thing, bringing them together in the room and seeing how they're acknowledged, how they're seen, how they're valued, and how that transfer into them walking into their own power is just an amazing process.
Yeah.
It's just an amazing process. And then once folks are able to connect at that individual group level, what they can do as we're calling it a coalition and a partnership, but what they can do as a collective, it's the most beautiful thing. It's really the most beautiful thing. Yeah. That's why I always like the conference. I'm still in awe at people saying that the conference was amazing. I'm still in awe of that. Yeah. Because when you're doing the work behind, like I told you, I wanted a small meeting. The partnership said, no, Chioma, we're going big. I was like, okay, we're just going to do this little thing. They said, no, Chioma, we're going big. And so when I remember I posted on LinkedIn after the summit, and I said, when you have a dope partnership, you do dope shit.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, once you have the partnership in place, once you have your process that is transparent, that is authentic, that is full with trust, that's about building, a center around community, your outcomes are going to be amazing. They're going to be more than what you could think it could ever be. Right. So that was just a testimony to me to be clear about that and stay grounded in that. Yeah.
Well, that seems like a good place to end it.
Oh.
I love that. That's a bit of a mic drop, but you're not allowed to drop these mics.
Okay, yeah, they look expensive.
These are not my mics.
They look expensive.
So I just want to thank you for joining me. That was such a fun conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. I'm excited about how you continue this conversation around partnerships and the critical point I think we are in and how partnerships can really move us into a better place than where we are right now. So thank you for your commitment to this work.
Of course. Thank you. Take care.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for joining me today. To see the episode transcript and show notes, head over to partnershipwork.podbean.com. I've included some links to places where you can learn more about today's guest and the topics we discussed. Partnership Work is an independent podcast created with the incredible support of the nonprofit organization Urban Media Arts here in my hometown of Malden, Massachusetts. Check them out at urbanmediaarts.org. I'll see you next time. Take care.